Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This is the continuation of Swallow the Stars. This will be Part 35, Chapter 35, entitled Nightmares and Revelations. On Saturday, Izuku wakes up from a nightmare to the feeling of Amahi writhing around in his chest. It's pitch dark in his room, cluing him into the fact that it's very early in the morning still, and he should probably try to go back to sleep. But he really doesn't think that that's in the cards for him right now, especially with how unsettled Amahi is. Stop it. He hisses, trying to push his thoughts in the same direction, even as he struggles to remember the contents of his nightmare. There were familiar white walls, but they were also unfamiliar, cold and lifeless in a way that was different from the facility. It had almost felt slimy, like there was a humidity in the air that shouldn't have been, clogging his throat and sticking to his skin. There had also been a rattling breath in his ear, and a hiccup sort of laughter that makes Izuku's skin crawl even remembering it. But other details, the actual events, evade him. At least Amahi settles down, coiling around his ribs with a cold temperature that makes Izuku shiver. Fuck it. There's no way he's getting back to sleep after this. Izuku rolls out of bed and spares a glance at the time, 5:43 in the morning, which means that Aizawa is back from his patrol and hopefully passed out in his bedroom, where he'll probably stay for another 4 or 5 hours. With his chest cold from Amahi and his nightmare still clinging to the fringes of his mind, Izuku grabs a sweatshirt from his closet before slinking from his room. The apartment is silent except for the humming of the refrigerator. Despite his usual eagerness to talk and his general enjoyment of being surrounded by sounds of life, distant conversations, laughter, the rustling of clothes as someone nearby moves, Izuku has always found a kind of peace in the quiet. He spent most of his life living in silence after all, and even now, after several years of being free of the facility, he thinks it's his natural state of being. He feels a bit like a ghost as he pads down the hallway and into the kitchen. He wants to make tea to both soothe and warm him, but he doesn't want to risk the sound of the kettle waking up Aizawa, so he settles for a glass of juice instead. He hesitates for a moment with the refrigerator door open, looking at containers of food and wondering if eating would help settle him or if it would just throw off his appetite for breakfast later. Eventually, he decides against food and just retreats to the living room. It's quiet. It feels even more quiet because he doesn't want to wake up his dad, but Izuku relaxes into it and curls up on the sofa, zoning out as the minutes tick by. The nightmare already feels distant and unreal, a twist of his memories into something unnatural designed by his brain to make him scared for whatever reason. Izuku doesn't really put stock into dreams, even though Auntie Kayama had said that they're people's subconscious ways of sorting through their thoughts and the information that they haven't processed yet. Izuku just thinks they're an interesting creative response to an external stimuli, or, in the case of his nightmares, a relieving of past trauma, and something that he hasn't figured out how to put behind him yet. He's working on it. Kiyumi-san says he's getting better, and for the most part, Izuku believes her, but sometimes, on mornings like this with a cold weight on his chest, and a quiet apartment around him, Izuku feels like the facility isn't much of a distant memory as he would like it to be. A soft but insistent chirping sound pulls him out of his thoughts as he casts his gaze around the room until it finally lands on Leo, trotting toward him from down the hall. Izuku smiles and watches as the big orange cat stretches before jumping onto the sofa, still chirping in confusion as to why Izuku's out of bed at this time of night. "You're going to wake up Dad," Izuku whispers, running his hand down Leo's head and back, smiling as he arches up into the petting. Leo nudges his paw at Izuku's leg for a moment before carefully climbing into his lap and settling down. The weight is nice, as is the residual body heat and the purring, and Izuku leans back into the cushions and lets himself drift a little. He doesn't manage to sleep, but he at least gets some rest. A few hours later, and earlier than Izuku was expecting, Aizawa's bedroom door opens and the man himself walks out into the living room with a wide yawn. He pauses when he spots Izuku, and Izuku just smiles at him. "You're up early," Aizawa says, eyes roaming his face like he's checking for injuries. "Everything okay?" Izuku snorts. "I could say the same for you." He regards his dad for a moment, taking in the heavy eye bags and the loose slouch to his shoulders. "Did you get hurt last night?" Aizawa narrows his eyes. "A couple of bruises, and you're avoiding my question." "Just a nightmare," Izuku says with a shrug and some nonchalance that he doesn't really feel. The nightmare is several hours behind him, but that weird, slimy feeling is still stuck in his throat, despite the glass of juice that he's finished off by now. Satisfied with that answer, Aizawa continues his trek into the kitchen. "Do you want tea?" "Coffee, please," Izuku says. He doesn't drink it often, not really liking the taste even with milk and sugar added, but he wants that bitterness right now. He's past the point of needing something soothing and just Wants something with a kick to get him the rest of the way out of the fog still residing behind his eyes. Aizawa grunts out an acknowledgement, and for a moment the quiet comes back. Coco joins him on the sofa, sniffling at Leo before curling up against Izuku's thigh, and he has a hand in her fur before the thought to do so even occurs to him, and it's comforting to know that this is something he can do at all. There are cats here, 2 of them, who like him enough to sleep with him and seek out his attention. He must zone out for a bit again, because the next thing he knows is that there's a mug of coffee being held out to him. Izuku blinks and reaches out to take it with a quiet, "Thank you." He watches Aizawa walk around the low table and take a seat on the chair across from the sofa. For a moment, neither of them say anything, just sipping their coffee and trying to bring themselves out of the haze of sleep. "Do you want to talk about it?" Aizawa asks after a few minutes have passed, setting his mug down to focus his attention on Izuku. Izuku shrugs. "It wasn't a memory," he says, because that's probably what his dad is worried about. I don't know. It was weird. Scary at the time, but now that I've been awake for a while, it's mostly just weird." He explains the nightmare in as much detail as he can, though even what he woke up with is mostly gone, and all he's really left with is the impression of white walls and the feeling of a slimy sort of moisture on his skin. Aizawa frowns, studying Izuku carefully. "And you're sure this isn't a memory?" It's not really a question, but Izuku shakes his head anyway. "I'm sure. The facility was very sterile. The air was kind of dry, actually, with how much it was cycled." He sighs and pushes a hand through his hair. "I really don't know what it was. Maybe just memories that were overlaid with bad feelings left over from the USJ. It's the only thing he can think of, and honestly, the slimy feeling in his throat is close enough to the feeling of black blood from Amahi's possessions that he wouldn't put it past his brain to make that connection." "Maybe," Aizawa says, as if he's hesitant to agree. "Are you still talking with Kiyumi-san about that? The USJ, I mean." Izuku nods. "Yeah, I almost watched you die. Of course I'm not over that yet." That and the additional dead bodies trailing in his wake, he's not sure if it's something he'll ever get over. "I'm still coming to terms with a lot of it, but Kiyumi-san thinks I'm coping well, so I'm not worried." To be fair, he hasn't told her about the people he killed. Any of them. He honestly doesn't know how to talk about it, and he isn't sure he ever will. Someday, maybe. Probably to Itoshi, if he ever gets to that point, as it is Nezu knows, and so does Aizawa and Hizashi, but that doesn't mean that Izuku wants to talk about it. Aizawa picks up his mug again and takes a sip. "Hizashi's coming over today," he says after a moment. "I want to check in with you about Amahi again, and he wants to be here for it." "How come?" Izuku tilts his head curiously, wondering if he did something wrong or not. "We just haven't talked about it in a while, and you spent the majority of last week not using it even in class. It's just a check-in, and maybe a conversation with it if you want." Aizawa doesn't seem mad or overly concerned, so Izuku relaxes into the sofa with a nod. "Oh, okay, yeah, that's fine." Thinking about it, it is a little weird that he's limited his use of Amahi's power lately. It's rational, in his opinion, because he literally killed people with it at the USJ, but it's still strange. For almost the entire time he's been living with Aizawa, practicing with and using Amahi's power was top priority for him, and Izuku always jumped at the chance to do it. He supposes, from an outside perspective, that might look similar to refusing to so much as pick up a butter knife after defending himself with a switchblade. Quirks are just tools, after all, even though Amahi is not and will never be a quirk. Silence stretches back over them for a while before Izuku no longer wants it, and he reaches for the remote and clicks on the early morning news. Izuku watches disinterestedly as the news anchors talk about general activity around Musutafu, new business opening, an event being held downtown later today, and a quick recap of the third-year sports festival, where Amajiki-senpai took second place and stood on the podium beside a widely smiling blonde boy named Togeda Mirio. Then the news shifts tone and Izuku frowns. Even Aizawa looks up from his coffee as the anchors begin to recap the events from earlier in the week. "The Turbo Hero Ingenium is finally cleared from critical condition after surviving an attack by the Hero Killer, staying on Wednesday afternoon in Hosu City. Sources say that he is awake and doing much better under the watchful eyes of his family." Shit. Izuku looks sideways at his dad, who's scowling down at his phone as he types on it. "Do you know him?" He's familiar with Ingenium, the way he's familiar with every active hero. He's analyzed Ingenium's quirk and has a 2-page spread of it in one of his notebooks. But he doesn't know personal information about him, or even what his personality is really like. Nice, probably. He's not high enough in the rankings to be too attention-seeking. "Not well, but we went to school together." Aizawa says, face scrunching up as he stares at his phone. Izashi's friends with him, and his brother's in your class. What? Really? Izuku turns away from the television entirely to stare at Aizawa. Who? Ida, Aizawa says. Ingenium's real name is Ida Tensei. He's Tenya's older brother. Holy shit, no wonder Ida had been absent at the end of the sports festival. I need to make a call. Aizawa gets to his feet, face still downturned into the glowing screen of his phone. Give me a minute. With that, he steps out onto the balcony and closes the door behind himself. Izuku's on his feet in the next moment, making Leo jump down as he goes to his bedroom to grab his phone. The first thing he does is text Ida to check in on him. He doubts he'll get a response, but both because they're not close and because Ida is probably in a very unsteady emotional position right now. But he wants to make sure that Ida knows he's included in the class and that automatically makes him a person who gets to receive concern from Izuku. He would do just about anything for all of his classmates, and if they're hurting, he wants to help. The second thing he does is start researching the villain mentioned on the news, the hero killer, Stain. Honestly, he's not expecting much. Izuku had done some analysis on villains before, their quirks, obviously, but also their methods and strategies when committing crimes. But it's all been done on villains who had been caught and whose secrets had been turned out like pockets for lunch money. Stain is very much still at large, but the amount of information on him is staggering. Not anything really helpful. There's no civilian identity and no information about his quirk, but his entire history as a villain is within Izuku's grasp. He starts reading. Aizawa re-enters the apartment a few minutes later, but all he does is go into the kitchen and start making food. Izuku doesn't look up from his phone, nor does he ask about the phone call. If he was meant to know, Aizawa would have told him. Instead, Izuku reads as many news articles as he can until he finally stumbles upon a blog post that's a veritable goldmine of information. A lot of it's theoretical, obviously, but the logic and reasoning of the author keeps Izuku's interest. Izuku, come eat. Aizawa calls begrudgingly. Izuku turns the screen of his phone off and sets it down before heading to the kitchen. Izashi's going to come over a little earlier than planned. He wants to go to Hosu to check on Tensei, and I asked him to see how Tenya's doing while he's there. Is Todoroki-kun coming as well? He asks as he sits down and slides his bowl of miso soup closer to him. No offense to Todoroki, but Izuku hopes not. He isn't sure if he's ready to explain the whole history to his new brother, not yet. He's actually not sure if he would have even told Hitoshi about it by now if they hadn't been kidnapped because of said history. Aizawa shakes his head as he takes his seat. No, he's going to go visit his mother today, apparently. I'm sure he'll come over later, though, since Hizashi won't be home. Izuku nods and hums as a response before tucking into his breakfast. His mind is swimming with information. Questions bouncing around facts, bouncing around even more questions. He doubts he'll get any answers further today, though, so he does his best to push away the remains of his nightmare and the news about Ingenium and the open blog forum about Stain. And he instead just focuses on eating in the promise of a quickly approaching session with Amahi. Take a deep breath for me, little listener, Hizashi says. Izuku listens, hauling air into his lungs through his mouth and letting it out through his nose. They're all sitting on the floor in the living room, the furniture pushed aside to give them space. Both the cats are cautiously sniffling around the new arrangement, checking to make sure there aren't demons or something hiding under the sofa. I feel fine, Izuku says. His eyes are open, he's not cold, and Amahi is quietly draped along his ribcage. Are you sure this is the right time to do this, though? We can wait till tomorrow. But Hizashi shakes his head. Nah, Tensei isn't going anywhere. Whether I rush over there now or wait until after, he's still going to be in the hospital. Hizashi tries for a smile, and he manages to more or less make it work. He's always been good at masking, though, just as good as Aizawa is, if in the opposite direction. Aizawa masks with a blank stare, and Hizashi masks with a smile. Izuku wonders which of his dads he takes after in that regard. Probably Hizashi. Okay, Izuku isn't going to argue, even if he is worried about Hizashi and Aizawa, though a little less so since he had admitted to not being very close to Ingenium. What are we working on right now, then? They're obviously not meant to be practicing, since they're inside a populated apartment building. Aizawa shifts his position, drawing Izuku's attention to him. At the sports festival, there were a couple of times that I noticed a shadow over you that looked like Amahi. I want to know why, I guess, and if it's going to be a consistent thing now. Oh. Izuku looks down at his hands, flexing them where they loosely rest in his lap. Yeah, I saw that too. In the match against Todoroki, I thought I saw a clawed arm out of the corner of my eye. He bites at his bottom lip, chewing on it a little before sucking in a breath. It happened at the USJ too. When I killed the Nomu, it didn't last long, a second at most, but I saw something. It's probably bad that he's not concerned about it, especially if both of his dads are. Even more reason to check in with Amahaki, then, yeah? Hisashi pats Izuku on the knee. Whenever you're ready. Izuku takes off his right glove without thinking about it. He's past the point of being afraid of Amahaki. He knows that his control's good, even when he's exhausted or injured. The only slip-up he's had was when he'd leaked a little power into the punch he gave Bakugo, but all things considered, that was fairly minimal. Amahaki floods from his chest, down his arm, and perches neatly in his palm, ready to move, ready to strike. Izuku takes another deep breath and reins the god back in. We're just talking. He pushes through his thoughts, waiting for the familiar feeling of Amahaki's response. The god doesn't disappoint, sliding its power away from Izuku's palms and back up his arm to perch on his shoulder. Izuku's upper body tilts sideways from the increase in mass, but he holds himself steady once he adjusts. The response he gets to his request to talk is a gentle feeling of acceptance, mixed with a little eagerness as well. Have you been wanting to talk? Amahaki's response is a flood of images that Izuku struggles to keep track of. Some of them are his own memories, point-of-view scenes from the USJ and the sports festival, but others are completely foreign to him. But, despite the lengthy stream of Amahaki's thoughts, the core of the response that Izuku instinctively understands is a simple yes, because a lot has happened. What do you want to talk about? There's a moment's pause before Amahaki's thousands of voices start to echo around in Izuku's skull. You are afraid again. Izuku furrows his brow, but when he notices Aizawa and Hisashi leaning in to check on him, he shakes his head and waves them off. I'm not afraid. I feel more in control now than I ever have before. Instead of agreement, Amahaki floods Izuku with a feeling of doubt and disquiet, very much the equivalent of someone arching an eyebrow and folding their arms across their chest. Izuku snorts. Okay, I can't hide anything from you, I guess. I am afraid. I killed people. Death is not as permanent as you believe. Matter and consciousness are both recycled the universe over. Sure, but those specific lives won't get another chance. They were people. They matter, even if their lives are small compared to yours. You were protecting yourself, were you not? Your existence will not be weighed any more heavily for their loss, or are you suggesting that their lives should hold more value than your own? Izuku blinks rapidly and pushes his consciousness to quiet the echoing of Amahaki's voices. Maybe he is overthinking all of this. He's never killed anyone out of malice, only out of a desire to survive, and he knows that the Hero Commission's lines on manslaughter blur when it comes to villains and barely exist at all when hero students are involved in random villain attacks. Izuku wouldn't be here otherwise. He'd be in jail already. But it's still a life. He still ended a life. Your guilt is penance enough. Do not cut me off. He brings up his hands to scrub at his face, and his right hand is noticeably cooler than his left, with the mark in his palm open to the air. Izuku, Hisashi's voice is just this side of concerned. Everything okay? Sorry, Izuku murmurs, dropping his hands so that he can see his dad's again. He tries for a smile to reassure them, but he isn't sure how well he succeeds. Got distracted. There was something Amahaki wanted to talk about first. Aizawa tilts his head. Care to share? Izuku gives a loose shrug of his shoulders. It's just the USJ again. The people I killed. Izuku. It's fine, Hisashi. Izuku insists with another smile. I'm working through it. I'm okay. I'll ask Amahaki about its power now. Give me a moment. Taking a slow, long, deep breath, Izuku recenters himself. Amahaki is still present in his mind, patiently waiting while Izuku talks to his family. He knows now, after its reaction at the USJ to Aizawa getting injured, that Amahaki recognizes Aizawa and Hisashi, and probably Hitoshi as well, as people that are necessary for Izuku's continued well-being. And he knows, too, that Amahaki is curious about that human connection because he can feel those emotions swirling around in his mind right now. We can talk about human concepts like family later, he promises, shifting his weight around so that he's more comfortable. For now, I want to ask if the amount of power that I'm able to control is increasing. Amahaki vibrates gently from its perch on Izuku's shoulder. Yes, you have trained well, and you can access more power now than you could before. There's a pause, but Izuku waits because he can tell that Amahaki is thinking of how to say whatever it is that it needs to communicate next. It is easier for me. That word, the self-identifying me, has more force behind it than most of Amahaki's words. To provide support when your emotions are high. It has happened before. Images, memories, flit past in Izuku's mind. The excitement of training on the beach, the fear and panic during the villain attack at the shop, The pain and disassociation at the end of battle trials, all moments when Amahaki had pushed its power past the usual boundaries, past Izuku's control, manifesting itself in a partially physical form in order to comply with what Izuku needed to happen. Izuku hums in quiet acknowledgement. Is there a limit to how much of your power I can use? Another pause, this one long enough that Izuku takes the moment of silence to repeat what Amahaki said to Aizawa and Hisashi. I do have more power, he explains. But it's usually as a result of high emotional moments. Wait, hold on. It's talking again. Vague humor slides through Izuku's mind before Amahaki speaks again. In theory, there's no limit to the amount you can use. If you so desired, you could destroy the galaxy in which you currently reside. That act, however, would result in your death due to overexertion. Therefore, realistically, yes, there is a limit to the amount of power you can use. That makes sense. Do you know where the line is? Yes, but due to our contract, if you ask for the power, I cannot deny it. Shit. So it's Izuku's responsibility to make sure he doesn't go overboard. That's infinitely more difficult, of course, since he doesn't usually realize how close to exhaustion he actually is until his gloves are back on and it slams into him. Can you warn me if I'm getting close to death? Amahaki vibrates again, and it's a feeling like agreement that slips through Izuku's mind. Good. Thank fuck. Thank you. I think that's all I need for now. When Amahaki doesn't seem to want to stop him, Izuku pulls his glove back on and blinks at his dad's. Well, good news, he starts, pushing a hand through his hair. The things that we saw were a result of me calling on more power than normal. If my emotions are high, Amahaki can do a partial physical manifestation without, possessing me. So that's cool. The bad news is that there's a hard limit to what I can safely use, and I don't know where that line is, and Amahaki can't refuse me if I ask for more power, but I did ask if it would warn me if I'm getting too close to dying, so there's that, I guess. Aizawa leans back on his hands and stares up at the ceiling. I'm not sure if that makes me feel better or not. Hisashi laughs, and it sounds nervous. Yeah, me either. He glances over at Izuku, who's biting his lip again, guilt running sharply through him. No, hey, little listener, come here. Hisashi holds his arms out, and Izuku slides over into his space, allowing himself to be wrapped up in a hug. This isn't your fault, okay? You're doing a great job. Shota and I are just worried about you. I know, Izuku murmurs, tipping his head against Hisashi's shoulder and watching Aizawa carefully. I don't like being the reason for you guys being so worried, though. Hisashi presses a kiss to the top of Izuku's head. We'd be worried about you regardless. Even if you didn't have an ancient god inside of you, we'd still be worried, because you're our son, you know? Aizawa tips his head back down and meets Izuku's gaze. Listen, problem child. It's not your fault that we're worried, and it's not your responsibility to try and keep us from feeling this way, understand? We just want you to be safe, and it's... Fuck, honestly, it's scary as hell to realize that there's not much either of us can do to help you. Izuku nods once. I understand. I'm sorry, I don't know, I'm trying. Hey, Hisashi squeezes him. You're doing a great job, kiddo. I don't think I'd be doing so well in your position. You've been through so much, and here you are worrying about us old guys. You have such a big heart. It's amazing, and we love you for it. I love you both, too. Izuku squeezes Hisashi around the waist and smiles at Aizawa. And I want to pick up training again. I don't want to have to rely on high emotions to get that kind of power again, you know? It would be a good idea to figure out my new limits. Aizawa reaches out and ruffles Izuku's hair. That's a great idea. We're already supervising you 4 brats every other day, so you can practice then, yeah? And if we have to move the practice to one of the replica urban settings, we'll do that. Some part of Izuku relaxes at that. He hasn't done anything wrong, he's not in trouble, and his dads are going to help him with getting a handle on his new power. He's not alone. There's no need to be afraid of what he can do with Amahaki. Thank you. He leans away from Hisashi and then gives his shoulder a small shove. You have a hospital to get to. I don't think we're going to get anything else out of Amahaki at the moment, so get going. He grins when he says it, but he's not going to take no for an answer. Laughing, Hisashi rolls onto his side with a shove and he gets to his feet. All right, bully your dear dad out of the apartment, why don't you? Kids these days, I swear. Hisashi ruffles Izuku's hair and shoots a finger gun at Aizawa. I'll send a text to update you on Tensei when I get there. Make sure Todoroki does his homework when he gets here. Zashi, Aizawa says with a long eye roll. Goodbye. Hisashi presses a dramatic hand to his chest and stumbles backwards, but he does make his way to the door where he shoves his feet into his shoes. You're both heartless. Goodbye. And then he's gone. Izuku sags and flops down on his back as soon as the door is closed. You okay? Aizawa asks, nudging Izuku's leg with his foot. Yeah, just wondering when we get to catch a break, you know? He's starting to think that maybe he is cursed in some way. Maybe it's because he's quirkless, or maybe it's just because of his contract with Amahi, or maybe he was just born under an unlucky star, but it really feels sometimes like everything that could go wrong or cause problems does. It's annoying. He hears Aizawa lay down on the floor too, the shifting of clothing and the low groan of effort giving him away. Izuku wants to say something about his dad getting old, but he bites his tongue on the comment. One thing at a time, problem child. One thing at a time. And yeah, that's about all there is to it. No matter what happens next, they'll handle it, and they'll make it out safely and come home afterwards. It's all they can do, and for now, that's just fine with Izuku. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 35 of Swallow the Stars. Chapter 36 will be next. Hope you all are still enjoying this fic, and as always, thank you so much for listening.